Hi, I'm a news dude, and here is some of the more of the news. Violence in the streets, violence in the sheets, and packages and synagogues and stuff. Yes, over the span of a few days, 3 separate instances of right-wing white supremacist terrorism occurred in the United States, which isn't new for the United States, but hopefully we'll get to all of them. But let's start with, as of this filming, at least 14 poorly made bombs were sent to many prominent figures in the Democratic Party and the fake news mainstream media. Many, or actually all, who have been frequently targeted and described as evil, worthy of being locked up by Donald Trump, the president of a country with people in it. And after decades of racist business practices and apparently decades of tax fraud and going bankrupt too many times with many failed businesses and other instances of fraud and becoming the villain on a reality show where he's an asshole who fires people and spending a few years loudly ranting about the first black president being a secret Kenyan Muslim, well, after all that, he decided to run for president because Mexico is sending us rapists and drug dealers. That's the reason he said he was running. It's the first thing he said. And so after capitalizing on a right-wing populist message and xenophobic demagoguery at his wild and unhinged ultranationalist rallies at which he suggested beating up protesters and promoted conspiracy theories about specific people, someone sent a bunch of bombs to those people. And when he was asked if he'd tone it down, he said no. He might even turn it up. And then he spent that rally blaming everybody else for the guy who frequented his angry rallies and sent bombs to the people the president blamed for the guy that frequented his angry rallies, who sent bombs to the people the president spent the rally after the bombs were sent blaming. And people who aren't in positions of power in the current government might be like, hey, that's f***ed up, man. I implore you, sir, to I don't know, stop it. Censuring the president is possible, simple, and easy. But the people who are actually in power, like to make up a term, the checks and balances on the president, don't care and continue to not say or do anything, or honestly connect what's happening with the president, to which they have all capitulated. Which, for no reason whatsoever, brings us to Paul Ryan in a segment we like to call This Week in History. It was 3 years ago this week that Paul Ryan, the Muppet who wished to be a real boy and almost became one, was elected Speaker of the House. He didn't have a very illustrious career before that. He'd served as the representative for Wisconsin's 1st District since 1999, and during that time, Ryan only successfully sponsored 2 bills in his congressional career, and one of them was to rename a post office. The other bill was to lower taxes on arrows, because he's a bow hunter, because of course he is. Paul Ryan also infamously charged his constituents admission to town hall meetings in Wisconsin's 1st District, and when poverty-stricken residents of his district who couldn't afford a ticket to the town hall showed up at his office 5 days in a row to try and speak to him about the lack of jobs and the highest unemployment rate in the state, Ryan's office filed a police report against them and had them locked out of the building. This is a common theme with a lot of the Republican Party because they're not so much fans of democracy or being held accountable these days. But before these days, Paul Ryan was Mitt Romney's running mate in 2012, and he lost. And Paul Ryan returned to the House, turned his hat backwards, and power-lifted out his frustrations until 2015, when, this week in history, he was elected Speaker. He wasn't the first choice, of course, and in May of 2017, Ryan led the House of Representatives to vote for repealing the Affordable Care Act in favor of the proposed but not yet existent American Health Care Act, effectively beginning the process of removing coverage from millions of Americans with nothing to replace it, because they can't seem to write a version of it that isn't on its face a Faustian contract to alchemize the souls of the poor into piles of delicious money. But thanks to Ryan pushing that vote through the House, which I guess means he technically did his job, the rogues gallery of Batman villains that makes up the GOP's Senate majority will keep trying until they get it, especially if they keep the House and the Senate. That same month, Ryan announced Congress's plan to pass massive tax reform by the end of the year, which they did. Congratulations, the wealthy. But we'll come back to that, because no discussion of Paul Ryan's legacy would be complete without bringing up the fact that he had a whole lot to do with why Donald J. Trump was allowed to be president of a whole country. Again, that people live in. And he did this because he will do anything and support anyone as long as he can get his tax cuts and cut Medicaid, something that, according to him, he's wanted to do since drinking beer in college. Like a loser. Side note, interestingly, the amount of money in Bush and Trump-era tax cuts is the same amount of money Republicans have proposed to cut from Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and Obamacare. Weird. Anyway, since supporting but not supporting, but then supporting Trump, like all Republicans, Reimann has done everything in his considerable power to keep Trump in office, which is no small task considering the president is a dumb, obvious criminal who is physically unable to stop himself from lying about literally everything all of the time. Here are examples of Paul Ryan doing literally nothing. And then in April of this year, Paul Ryan had the gall to announce that he wouldn't be running for re-election after pushing through legislation that will do nothing but further increase income disparity and the national deficit for decades to come and setting President Donald J. Trump loose on America like f***ing Kong. He's taking his ball, which in this case is made of billions of dollars of tax breaks, and he's going home. Because Paul Ryan and the rest of the GOP don't care, as long as they can fulfill their terrible dreams. That's why, after a frequent attendant of the president's traveling dark carnival sends bombs to all of the president's most prominent enemies and stars of some particularly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and then says he'll actually amp up the crazy, and then does? Well, nobody's gonna say anything. Certainly not Paul Ryan. The most they can muster is a shake of the head or a tweet of the thumbs. Like after a bunch of self-avowed neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville, leading to one of them murdering a person who was protesting those neo-Nazis. Here's another one next to that one who's been convicted of a separate act of right-wing terrorism. But anyway, the president said that there were fine people on both sides. And when asked if he was going to condemn the president for complimenting Nazis, Paul Ryan said that criticizing Trump for his very fine neo-Nazi comments would be, quote, some partisan hackfest. But here's some partisan hackfest. What you just said, Paul. Because actually, coming together and censuring the president for complimenting some very fine neo-Nazis who support him is a bipartisan good fest. Paul Ryan is Speaker of the House. He's currently the third possible president. And he's totally cool with Stephen King, a congressman and a freaking white supremacist, being there. And he's just gonna leave and get away with it. And here's some more news. After a month of almost calling himself a nationalist, but instead saying he subscribes to the doctrine of patriotism, which isn't a thing, Donald Trump proudly said he's a nationalist, and people don't say that anymore, and he doesn't explain why. And when asked if it was code for white nationalist, he said, quote, I've never heard that theory about being a nationalist. I've heard them all. And that's weird, that the president said he's never even heard of white nationalism, considering a year earlier when he talked about all that white nationalist stuff. Option one is that he doesn't know what white nationalism is, which is a problem for a president, especially, but not exclusively, a president who's supported by white nationalists. Option two is that he knows what it is, and he's lying, and that's bad. Option 2A, he knows, and he believes in it. Option 2B, he knows, and he doesn't believe in it, but he thinks it's funny, and he's just trolling you, making half the country think he's really cool with white nationalists. Option 2C, he knows, and he doesn't care, and he's just using it for power. And none of those options are good. As Florida gubernatorial candidate Andrew Gillum points out about his own opponent.
Now, I'm not calling Mr. DeSantis a racist. I'm simply saying the racists believe he's a racist.
But Paul Ryan, and in fact, no member of the Republican Party, will say anything like that or hold the president accountable because they're busy blaming people like Maxine Waters, which actually plays into Trump's hands because Maxine said, get in representatives' faces. But Trump twisted her words and said she thinks people should hurt his supporters and she better be careful what she wishes for. Some lunatic hearing Bernie Sanders truthfully say the Republicans are going to take away people's health care, which will cause people to die, and then shooting Republicans, leading to no new gun legislation, is apparently the same as the maniacal president regularly targeting people and riling up crowds and pushing conspiracy theories and praising the good old days when violence was acceptable. They're the same, you see. Mitch McConnell having a bad time at dinner because someone yelled at him.
Oh, yeah? Why don't you get out of here? Why don't you leave the entire country?
That's political violence, you see. To these people, fascism and white supremacy, they're the same as the very idea of socialism and opposing white supremacy. Both sides, you see. Also, a couple of side notes. Right-wing terrorism is the most prevalent form of terrorism in America. There are at least 19.5 million self-identified far-right white nationalists and neo-Nazis in the country. They've been slowly infiltrating the military and law enforcement for years. And according to the FBI, white supremacist terrorism is as big a threat to the United States as ISIS. As I said earlier, just this past week, a white supremacist tried to break into a black church, was locked out, so he went to a grocery store and shot 2 random black people. A Trump supporter and self-described white supremacist sent a bunch of bombs to the president's political opponents, and a white supremacist shot up a synagogue. And the president was like, this wouldn't have happened if they had guns, despite 3 cops being shot, and if only they had guns being an anti-Semitic talking point about the Holocaust. But what else can be done, you know? There's fine people on both sides. It's hard to speak up when you're the Speaker of the House, or when you're accepting a platform of violence and hatred and xenophobia and nationalism in exchange for tax cuts and pushing through an unprecedented number of conservative judges. It's hard because powerful people are having bad dinners. And breaking news from the inside of my skull, Mitch McConnell is bad. Maybe the worst, which we'll get to. Since the GOP hastily jammed through a tax bill in December, lowering corporate taxes from 35% to 21%, companies have used an estimated $33 billion of the surplus for stock buybacks and business investments, while spending only $8 billion on worker wages and benefits. Meanwhile, the average hourly wage has gone from $9.23 in September of 2017 to a whole 4 cents higher. Congratulations, everybody! Although when adjusting for inflation, the Hill estimates that the increase is actually a decrease. So way less. Congratulations, everybody. Meanwhile, even more, the Treasury Department announced that the federal deficit has jumped 17% as a result of corporate tax collections, falling 31% since the GOP bill. Hey, what does Mitch think about all this?
It's very disturbing, and it's driven by the 3 big entitlement programs that are very popular: Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid.
See, what Mitch is saying is that despite the fact that the GOP's bill has raised our deficit with unhelpful corporate tax cuts that have disproportionately benefited people who don't need it, we should go after Medicare and Social Security because they take up a much larger part of our spending. You know, like how if you lose $500 at the racetrack, you should make up the difference by not paying your rent? And while it's true that the costs of Medicare are on the rise, that has a lot to do with the rising costs of treatments and medication, thanks to companies like Pfizer jacking up their prices. Although, the president has recently announced his intent to lower those prices via deals with those companies that also happen to be making billions of dollars off of the GOP's tax cuts. So yeah, way to go, Mitch! And this leads us to a segment called Mitch McConnell is Extremely Bad Regularly. I guess it's not really a segment so much as it is a very obvious statement about Mitch McConnell. We all love taking the easy shots at old Mitch because he looks like all of the Land Before Time characters post-asteroid and sounds like Jimmy Stewart's Zombie. But I'd like to get beyond all that and take a fair and balanced look at how consistently wrong the man has been for his entire infinity-long political career and current job as Majority Leader of the United States Senate, and how he perfectly represents the current Republican Party and the slow deterioration of our democracy. Fun! While we're still talking about the GOP tax bill, it should be noted that back when it was first proposed, the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that it would add $1 trillion to the deficit, to which Mitch McConnell claimed, and it's a quote, "I'm confident this is not only revenue neutral to the government, but actually it's very likely to be a revenue producer." He was wrong. And Mitch is often wrong, and also bad, about a lot of things. I'm not just talking about the more divisive viewpoints like gay marriage or abortion, but more specifically about how he doesn't actually care for doing his job. And that his number one goal is to gain and then hold on to power. And for some reason, he remains in power, despite being very bad and wrong about all of the things he was elected to do. And let's start with why he got into politics in the first place, as described by his own memoir, Long Game, which is a term used often by grifters to describe gaining advantage by patiently scamming people over a long period of time, which I'm sure is a coincidence. In his introduction, talking about why he ran for office, he notes, "Few of us expect to be at the center of world-changing events when we first file for office, and personal ambition usually has a lot more to do with it than most of us are willing to admit. That was certainly true for me." It's a depressingly telling admission that not only did he go into politics for personal gain, but he assumes everyone around him feels the same way. And in fair and balancedness, TMCR-edness, this certainly does seem like the case for Mitchie's wife and Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao, seen here next to our president as he defends Nazis, who is worth $22 million thanks to an inheritance from her father, the chairman of a Chinese shipping company. Elaine has been largely reluctant to hold press conferences, except for the time she did an interview with her father in the Department of Transportation offices to promote his business, which is illegal. In other words, Mitch McConnell is very rich and has close ties to other people who want to stay very rich. And by multiple accounts and interviews over the years, it's clear that Mitch McConnell's number one political technique is to acquire money from rich people in exchange for political favors. Like, no foolin', Mitch seriously loves money. In the 1970s, when he taught a political science class, the very first thing he would do is write "money, money, money" on the chalkboard. He has raised nearly $220 million as a senator, often for other senators, who later rewarded him with support. According to Senator Alan Simpson, when Mitch McConnell asks for money, quote, "his eyes would shine like diamonds." This is all according to a 2006 article by the Pulitzer Prize-winning Lexington Herald Leader, which goes on to point out that Mitch typically shies away from mass fundraisers appealing to lower-class voters and focuses on $1,000-plus donations you get at private events and receptions. He also missed 83% of his assigned committee hearings, many about government spending, to reportedly focus on his fundraisers. The article also points out his heavy ties to gambling and tobacco lobbyists, something that can be corroborated by this 1998 article, where Mitch got heat for secretly telling his fellow senators that if they voted to kill comprehensive tobacco legislation, the cigarette manufacturers would run television advertisements supporting them. Hey, do we have a clip of Mitch blatantly trying to downplay cigarettes, preferably while throwing teenagers under the bus?
The fact is, more teens are smoking marijuana than are smoking cigarettes.
Mitch loves money, specifically rich people money, not smelly poor people money. Back in 1997, he boasted about how his state of Kentucky had more registered Democrats, but he was able to win because he had raised more money. And the thing is, he's right. Mitch doesn't win his elections by a huge margin, often oozing through the cracks like a phloem weasel. In his 2008 election, he won by only 6%. His second ever race was a difference of 40,000 votes, and in his first election, he won by a little over 3,000 votes. In his more recent 2014 victory, voter support for a Kentucky incumbent was at its lowest since 1938, while Mitch outspent his opponent 3 times over. Even in his pre-Senate days as a Jefferson County judge, Mitch was barely re-elected even though he triple outspent his opponent. Mitch f***ing sucks. And the only thing that gets him elected is the massive amount of cash he gets from rich people coupled with voter apathy. It should be no surprise that the issue Mitch seems most regularly passionate about is campaign finance reform, specifically opposing any limit on private donors.
What we should not have is a limit on participation of individuals. And that's the danger of the measure S2, which is before the Senate, which puts a cap on spending.
Mitch. You thinking that more money should equal more influence in our democracy. Wow, what a Not democracy, that is. The man is like a political caricature made alive with a genie trick. He is obsessed with money and power and willing to say anything as long as it maintains those things. Back in September of 2006, when Democrats urged President Bush to do something, anything besides staying the course in Iraq, Mitch McConnell issued a statement mocking them for wanting to retreat. Years later, that same president, the Bush one with the one with the child brain, somehow managed to put out a memoir talking about the time in old September of the 2006s when his buddy Mad Dog Mitch privately urged him to pull troops out of Iraq because it was making their party unpopular. That's right. While he was publicly mocking the idea of retreat, Mitch was privately advocating for it. That Mitch. To put it simply, the man has two faces, and they're both bad. When the Affordable Care Act was implemented, his own state of Kentucky became one of the first success stories after creating the enrollment website Connect, which immediately enrolled 413,410 people. In less good and more dumb news, the people of Kentucky seem to have no idea that Connect was the same thing as Obamacare, leading Mitch McConnell to omit that detail when discussing its repeal back in 2014, then lying about what he said, then trying but failing to pass the Senate healthcare bill that would have specifically hurt his home state. But old Mitch Face Mad Dog Money Man isn't just a turd at running his state, he's also generally terrible at his job. Not only did he fail to repeal Obamacare and got tweet dunked on by a 72-year-old G-list president, but according to interviews with Politico, Mitch has also brought the Senate to a near standstill, causing many senators from his own party to skip work. That tax reform bill I mentioned, the one that raised the deficit, it had originally been planned to retract the corporate alternative minimum tax, and then just forgot to do that because of how hastily they got it passed. This is like basic office junk, you guys. One time in 2012, Mitch McConnell disingenuously proposed a bill he thought would divide Democrats for the purpose of partisan gain, and then when the Democrats accepted his bill, he was forced to filibuster it himself. He filibustered his own bill to the shock and confusion of everyone, to the point that one of the senators had to get up and remark what an insane waste of time the moment was.
So this may be a moment in Senate history when a senator made a proposal and when given an opportunity for a vote on that proposal, filibustered his own proposal. I think we have now reached a new spot in the history of the Senate we've never seen before.
Imagine sucking at your job so hard because you don't believe in anything but money and power that everyone you work with just stops to reflect on how unprecedented and special your ineptitude is. It's both unique and disheartening, like watching a leprechaun shit its pants from too hard, or a unicorn with a swastika painted on it. And hey, speaking of swastikas, Christopher Browning, a lauded historian of the Holocaust, has written an article about how Trump being enabled by the GOP sure looks like Hitler's rise to power. One comparison Browning points out is the similarity between Germany President Paul von Hindenburg and Mitch McConnell, who he refers to as the gravedigger of democracy. See, because of the shrinking popularity of conservatism at the time, Hindenburg allowed Hitler to be chancellor in exchange for support, his assumption being that he could control him. He was wrong. This was made easier not only by an economic crisis and fear of communist takeover, but an increased divide in the country and political gridlock. People moved toward an extremist group and then allowed that group to have total control. Meanwhile, Hindenburg let it happen because he wanted to maintain his power. And just to be very clear, I'm not saying that Trump is going to Hitler all over everybody. I've already talked about how Trump isn't Hitler, but Trumpism is a synonym for fascism. And if you don't want to be called a fascist, stop supporting Donald Trump, a fascist. But there's a reason this expert on the Holocaust came forward, and it's not fake news, or Lugenpress if you prefer. There's a reason a bunch of historians are writing books about the rise of fascism now, after 2016. People called Bush a fascist, but historians didn't validate that. This administration is the real deal, the real art of the deal. Oh, and here's some more news. Also this week in history, Benito Mussolini installed the fascist government of Italy. I don't know why I thought of that. But the point is, historians are recognizing the feelings and ideas and qualities of fascism rising. When people make Hitler comparisons or fascist accusations, they're not talking about Nazi Germany at the height of Nazi Germany. They're talking about the fall of the Weimar Republic and the rise of fascist movements. And speaking of fascist movements and maybe violent people who go to rallies that promote violence, here's a clip of a fascist rally of thousands of American fascists meeting in the 1930s.
Do I hear somebody over there? Knock the crap out of him, would you? Seriously. Get him the hell out of here, will you, please? Throw him out! I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. Knock the hell. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees, I promise.
So that's a similarity. Took a little liberty with the audio there. And according to historians who know history, a thing we should try to learn from, another of the many similarities is Mitch McConnell, the exact kind of self-serving hack that would allow a country to fall apart for his own gain. Just go back and look at literally everything he did while Obama was president. Mitch pretty much swore a blood oath to the political equivalent of a limp child being dragged through a department store. When Obama formed a stimulus plan to bounce back from the previous recession, Mitch tried to slow it down as much as possible, later criticizing Democrats for giving bailouts to Wall Street while simultaneously recognizing the time he supported Bush doing the same thing, saying it is not to say that we think it ever ought to be done again. In other words, he was okay with it when his team did it. His biggest goal of 2010 was to make Obama a one-term president, and when he failed at that, big surprise, he got revenge by blocking his Supreme Court nomination and then saying this.
One of my proudest moments is when I looked at Barack Obama in the eye and I said, Mr. President, you will not fill this Supreme Court vacancy.
According to Mitch McConnell's own flappy little maw, one of his proudest moments ever was obstructing his political opponent using underhanded techniques, causing the U.S. Supreme Court to deadlock, and handing the nomination to a hollow f***ing ghoul who doesn't understand due process entirely for partisan reasons. That's one of his proudest moments. Because he hates democracy, and he only cares about power. All of them do. Which is why tough Texan Ted Cruz went from this...
Vote your conscience...
to this.
God bless President Donald Trump.
Ted Cruz blamed Maxine Waters and Cory Booker for the rally goer who sent bombs to Maxine Waters and Cory Booker. They only care about power. They might project the opposite.
Boy, y'all want power. God, I hope you never get it.
But the Democrats had power, Lindsay. And when they did, they didn't stop you from getting Supreme Court justices or ram through a bunch of federal judges while everyone was at home. You have the power. And what do? You capitulate to this guy. And in response to sexual assault survivors wanting some thing, you are cruel. Great use of power, my dude. Even Republicans, who are supposedly reasonable because they don't have to be re-elected, are useless. Jeff Flake, who voted to move then Judge Kavanaugh forward, was like real on the fence but wanted a kind of FBI investigation and was real torn up but voted anyway, said he's not sure if Brett Kavanaugh was lying about all that stuff he lied about. Ah, shucks. This has been our new segment, Jeff Flake, You're the Worst One. But anywho, these people, specifically Mitch McConnell, need to f***ing go. So for the love of God, my Kentucky buddies, you need to get out to those polls and vote this November 2020. Okay, well, we can't deal with Mitch yet. But we can make it very clear to Mitch that we don't want him hanging around no more by voting out all of his friends. Take away some of his power. Take away the word majority from his title because he doesn't deserve it. Because after decades of gerrymandering and voter suppression and forcing political gridlock and, as we've discussed, dismantling democracy, he needs his power taken from him because he's proven he doesn't deserve it. None of them do because they're allowing this in order to get this. And they're all just lying about how much they care about protecting pre-existing conditions, something they all voted against. And some of them, including the Trump Justice Department, is suing to get rid of them. And all of the Republican senators are campaigning on health care and lying about it. None of them seem to care that Steve King just keeps retweeting Nazis and endorsing white nationalists for mayor. And he went to Poland to debate the Holocaust. And nobody has said anything. None of them seem to have a problem with pushing George Soros conspiracy theories or caravan conspiracy theories. Side note, the perpetrator of the deadliest terror attack against Jewish people in America a couple of days ago was reportedly in large part about how the Jews are behind the caravan. So we need to vote them all out, even though there's tons of reports of voter suppression, more than is normal, and take away some of Mitch McConnell's power for the next 2 years of his term. And I know it's not as cathartic, but going back to his memoir title, his greatest skill is playing that long game and being just boring enough to eke by on mountains of cash and voter apathy. But we can be just as patient and shut his mediocre ass down. In the meantime, there's always bothering him in restaurants, and voting out Ted Cruz, and the liars who don't give a f*** about your health, and the actual neo-Nazis like Steve King, who was the co-chair of Ted Cruz's presidential campaign. So vote Ted out again. Vote them all out. All of the people who aren't necessarily white nationalists or fascists themselves, but sure f***ing love people who are. All of the people who are very okay with him responding to an act of domestic terrorism by toning it up, his words. Don't send any of them bombs, obviously. Just vote them out and bother them. Because they're bad. Hey everybody, thanks for watching that video. Be sure to like and subscribe and check out our podcast, Even More News, on all the podcast things, and our patreon.com/somemorenews, and other links maybe in the description of the video.